Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson. What's up?
Well, hello and welcome to the Got a Minute podcast. I'm Larson Hicks with I don't know, Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville and Sycamore Physician Contracting. That's kind of my world. We've got my co-host here, Pastor Rich Luss down in Birmingham. What's up, man?
Yeah, great to be with you, Larson.
Yeah, you're internet famous this week. You were on Fight Laugh Feast talking about your latest book, The Measure of the Mission. That go well?
That was great fun. No, it's wonderful. Yeah, it's a lot of fun talking to those guys.
Cool. Did you do that remotely? I guess you didn't go up there.
I did. I was not in Moscow. No, I did it from here, but really enjoy those guys and good conversation. I also did a podcast. Probably recorded about a month ago, but might also be interesting for our listeners with 1819 News. Which,
cool. Brian Dawson.
If people don't know about 1819 News here in Alabama, it's a great way to follow what's going on in our state. And that one was on basically what to look for in a church.
Oh, cool.
That's what we talked about. So I was on there with Brian Dawson. And that's gotten good response
that's awesome.
too. So 2 podcasts recently.
Well, since we're plugging podcasts, I just did a podcast episode that I think dropped yesterday on my channel, which I haven't really done anything on my channel since you and I started podcasting together. I sort of let my own channel sort of slowly die, but I've wanted to get back on and do something. And I had a text thread going with Michael Foster and Santiago Pliego. I don't know if you guys saw his interview with Tucker Carlson on an article he wrote called The Vibe Shift. But Santiago was one of my rugby players. I coached him in rugby back when he was in Moscow at New St. Andrews. And so it was fun. And actually we found it was kind of funny to find out that both me and Michael Foster were both trying to hire him to come work for us at our respective jobs at the same time. And he rejected both of us and went to work for New Founding. So, but I think I was second place. Santiago told me, "Hey, I'm going to accept the job, conditioned upon this interview I've got in Texas, because I promised those guys first I'd go down. So it's like, if that one doesn't work out, then I'll come work for you." So anyway, but that was a cool conversation. We talked about masculinity. We talked about dominion, talked about kind of like internet culture warriors and video games and kind of some of the ways that guys these days try to, flex like they're masculine, but in real life, they're not really doing anything of really any real value. So anyway, I'll stop plugging that one. That was pretty fun. Today, we're excited. We've been looking forward to this one for a while. We've been trying to get it scheduled. And so like, it's not as hot a topic in the news right now, but it's certainly still very, very important. We've got Caleb Bryd, who's an attorney in Huntsville, Alabama. We're also members together, the same church here in Huntsville. So he wrote an article in the Sentinel, Republic Sentinel, about IVF and about kind of all of the stuff that has been going on in the Alabama Supreme Court and legislation in Alabama on that topic. So Caleb, we're really pumped to have you. Great article. We really enjoyed it. Felt like you uncovered a lot of really important issues there.
Yeah, very helpful.
No, I'm glad to hear that it was helpful. We tried to intentionally attack this in such a way that there is a lot of legalese that's going on, a lot of background that the court really gets into, but
right.
We wanted to be able to at least present this in a way that exactly for guys like you, that you can take this and go to your congregation and say, hey, these are concerns we have, and these are questions we've got to start asking.
Right.
And then looking at our legislature and say, hey, you have a duty as a magistrate to uphold God's law. What's happening here, and why aren't you doing that?
Right. 100%. Well, we want to dive into the issues, but I think it'd be helpful just to kind of set the stage, Caleb. If you could just tell us, who are you? What's your background? Sort of give us the overview, so our listeners kind of know why they should listen to you.
Yeah, so I'm a lifelong Alabama native. Grew up just down the road here in Hartselle, Decatur area.
Okay.
Uh, Graduated Auburn University, then Liberty University for law school. After Liberty, I spent 7 years in the U.S. Army JAG Corps. Most of that time on active duty as a JAG. As a JAG, there's really two roles, two jobs that I primarily had as a JAG. One was an operational international law attorney deployed in 2019, doing kind of the sexy fun stuff that every JAG wants to be able to have an opportunity to do. And then came back and spent the last 4 years of my JAG Corps career litigating cases. And
Okay.
so I left the JAG Corps back in July, came back to Huntsville, was excited. My family and I were excited to join Trinity. It's been an absolute blessing for us. And I've spent since almost a year now, since July of last year, working with Davis Younts, who you guys may know. Um, Litigating military cases, veterans cases, religious liberties cases, and
Cool.
so my primary role as an attorney is I'm a litigator first and foremost. I'm a courtroom guy,
Cool.
and so that's my background.
Very cool. Well, I have an office downtown across from the courthouse, so I've a couple different times seen you walking, downtown, probably to and from court. So I can vouch that Caleb's a real deal. Well, okay. So IVF, in vitro fertilization. I went to lunch, I don't know, close to 10 years ago now, with a friend in Huntsville who's at a Presbyterian church, and he's a fertility doc, and he does a lot of IVF stuff. And then I have a friend, my father-in-law has a neighbor friend who does tons of work with IVF stuff. And it's always felt weird and ethically perilous, to me. But to be totally honest, I'm not. I don't interact with it on a daily basis. Not something I think about on a daily basis. So I haven't really known, how best to think about IVF. So I think your article really stirred up a lot of thoughts there. Can you maybe just tell us, just what is IVF? How does it work? And why is it something we should be concerned about?
Yeah, so fundamentally, if we can just take the scientific idea of IVF and just boil it down as small as possible,
Right.
is IVF effectively takes eggs from a woman, sperm from a man, combines them, literally in a petri dish to
Right.
create a human life. The general process that you see most often with IVF is what you call egg harvesting, right? So this is where you take multiple, a dozen or more eggs
Right.
from the woman, you harvest those, and then you or not implant, but you create life with every single one of those embryos by fertilizing it with a sperm. And then what happens is these fertilized embryos now go into a freezer awaiting implantation.
Okay.
And so the problem with this, just right off the bat, immediately becomes the majority of fertilized embryos that are created through the IVF process are either discarded or frozen indefinitely in cryogenic clinics.
Yeah.
And so, this immediately creates moral hazard. Now,
Right.
stack on top of that moral hazard is the eugenics project that is inherent in IVF.
Yeah.
For example, IVF screens for Down syndrome and discards any embryos that test positive for Down syndrome and other genetic abnormalities. But even more than that, what about picking your child's height?
Right.
What about picking their eye color?
Right.
Most common is picking their gender. Even people who I've met numerous people who had no problem getting pregnant whatsoever, but started using an IVF process because they had multiple boys and they wanted to have a girl and then stop having kids. Right. So they go to the IVF clinic and they selectively select for
Right.
female embryos.
Right.
And so the problem you start running into with IVF as a technology is that right now, and this is really how the Alabama Supreme Court described it, it is the absolute wild west when
Mm.
it comes to ethical limitations on IVF. And the problem that we see is most people they don't want to. Most people don't think in biblical categories. They
Right.
don't think in ethical categories. So to ask them to think in bioethical categories is a bridge too far for most people. It feels
Right.
like.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's uh, I think it's one of those things that's just out of sight, out of mind. It's sort of lives under this nebulous term that I think we should probably, as Christians, start to be far more suspect of kind of reproductive health,
Yeah.
and sort of what's happening. I don't think most think of IVF as eugenics or selecting, a designer child and discarding embryos that don't meet your standards. But I mean that's exactly what's happening, and I think it's horrific. I mean it's kind of crazy to think of. I mean, if these went to full term and then they were discarded, of course everybody would just be appalled. But the fact that it's happening, a few months earlier, sort of keeps it under the radar. So yeah, the transhumanism sort of idea. I mean, the thought that this feels a little bit like, I've heard people talk about sort of the Nephilim and the like, the idea that what was happening prior to the Tower of Babel was this transhumanism stuff, like humans trying to take control of genetics and of to sort of transcend the limitations, the normal limitations of that God's placed on us biologically. And so this is obviously a different version of that, but still it's kind of in that same category of sin and arrogance.
Yeah, I completely agree. Um, really one of the big questions here is, would eugenics by any other name smell as sweet, right?
Hmm.
Because most people, when you mention IVF, what most people assume is that, hey, you guys just hate women and you don't want infertile women to be able to have children.
Right.
Uh, that's simply not the case. From a theological perspective, Christians have had an answer for infertility since the dawn of time.
Right.
Right? As Christians, we believe that God opens the womb and God closed the womb. God blesses, God curses. And there are so many numerous examples of this throughout the Bible. Uh, you know, whether it's Sarah, whether it's Rachel, whether even Elizabeth in the New Testament, we
Right.
see this continuing theme of infertility and children as a blessing from the Lord. And so Christians have a clear category for how to deal with these types of issues.
Right.
But unfortunately, and I'll tell you, Emma Waters over at the Heritage Foundation did a phenomenal job in the American Reformer
Yeah.
breaking down the major denominations and what their position statements are on
Mm.
IVF. And it's clear that the majority of even conservative denominations have not put any thought into this whatsoever.
Wow.
Outside of the Roman Catholic Church and the Lutheran Missouri Synod, almost no one has a clear statement
Hmm.
on IVF at this point.
Interesting. Yeah,
And
that
it, and
seems
if
like a call to action.
and if the pulpits aren't clear, we shouldn't be surprised when our congregations struggle through these issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you raise a really good point there about the pulpits. As a pastor, I've got a vested interest, obviously, in teaching my people and shepherding them on issues like this, so that they can understand how the Word of God comes to bear upon something like this. I think in a lot of people's mind, it is, as you said, it's about infertility. People want children. That's a good desire. So why can't we do everything in our power to help them get children? I
Right.
think there are a lot of problems with looking at it that way. One of them is that it completely disregards what is best for the children who might be
Mhm.
created through this process.
Mhm.
So obviously, it's one thing if you've got a husband and a wife, they want to have children, they're not able to, and so they look to IVF. And then let's say that they only fertilize as many eggs as they're willing to implant. They're willing to take responsibility for all the children they create, that kind of thing. That is
Mhm.
one way of looking at what could happen here.
Yeah.
But the reality is, IVF opens us up to the creation of children outside of God's designed family structure. So outside of male female marriage, and opens the door to things like, well, of course, obviously, same sex adoption. It opens the door um, as you said, eugenics, and
Yeah.
basically the child selection. Opens the door to surrogacy and all the
Oh yeah.
problems involved with that. So bringing a third party into the reproductive process. So there are all kinds of other issues there. And so long as we're only thinking about the infertile couple and their
Right.
desire for a children, we're going to go
Right.
down a certain path. If we start to think about what is best for the children who are actually created, I mean, obviously one problem with this is a lot of the children being created in the IVF process are being destroyed.
That's right.
Or, you talked about creating moral hazard. Just the freezing and then thawing process is very often fatal for these children. And if we really understand that these really are children, and so we're really playing around with human lives here, it just really puts it in a whole different perspective. And then I don't know if you've come across Katie Faust's work on this. Her book Them Before Us is really, really interesting. She's got a lot in her book, which I would highly recommend to people, about IVF, about surrogacy. But she has a lot of testimonies of children who were created by IVF and now have come to adulthood, and
Mm.
there is a wound that is there because they don't
Mm.
know their genetic background.
Yeah.
Biology
Right.
really does matter. They don't know where they came from. You
Mhm.
can't know who you are unless you know whose you are. How
Right.
did I come to be? Was I picked out of a catalog? Because mom
Mm.
went to the sperm bank. Do I know
Oh, yeah.
whether or not I'm dating a brother or sister? I mean,
Oh yeah.
because a lot of this stuff is shrouded in secrecy. You don't know your genetic identity. I actually saw an article a while back that talked
Mm.
about two people who were in a dating relationship, and it turned out they were related and did not know it. They were like, it was like a brother sister kind of thing. It would have been incest had they gone forward with this, and they did not know that because of IVF, and it shrouded their genetic background. So just there's so many other issues that get raised by this.
Mm.
If we say that God's norm is for a child to be created by the loving embrace of a mother and father who are married, who are in covenant with each other, that
Right.
is the norm, IVF departs from that norm in so many really destructive ways. And I think a lot of people in our churches are just not aware of all of the moral issues involved in IVF.
Well, and it's really one of those things. Like if you remember back to Proverbs, right? You shall not move the ancient boundary markers, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Think of how many ancient boundary markers IVF just nukes right off the bat.
Yeah.
Surrogacy is a great place to start with that conversation. Historically, in the common law of England and most Western states recognized surrogacy is evil. It turns children into a commodity and it leads to child trafficking. That's the
Mm.
end result. And so the common law put barriers and made surrogacy an unenforceable contract, right? You can't enter a surrogacy contract and then enforce it by ripping a child away from its mother. This was unenforceable under the common law because it turns children from image bearers of God into commodities just like cattle.
Mhm.
And so now when you add the additional layer on this that uh, the majority of IVF being used outside of infertile couples is um, sodomites trying to have children by another means,
Mm.
right?
Right.
And so now you have this added layer of, hold on, wait a second. So we're going to move this ancient marker. We're going to get away from the unenforceability of surrogacy contracts, and then we're going to start allowing these people to selectively, selectively use surrogacy contracts for children. It's so far outside of God's norm of marriage
Yeah.
that it's really difficult when you sit down and think, hey, how did we get here, right?
Yeah.
And so you talk about moral hazards. I mean, these just completely stack on one another.
Yeah.
Um, at least as a minimum, I was looking back at it today. The Lutheran Missouri Synod, at least in their definitions for moral uses of IVF, it has to be married couples using eggs and sperm from themselves only, and then every embryo created has to be implanted. So at least
Exactly.
that's clear, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there now I do think there's some real theological arguments about, hey, can we even get to this from a theological perspective? But at least that's that is a limitation on all the other issues that come out of IVF, because unfortunately this kind of technology is really a Pandora's box.
Yeah, and so the way you described it, the position of the Missouri Synod Lutherans, and I think there are certainly a lot of other Christians who would take a similar stance. At least that respects
Yeah.
God's design for family. It respects God's design um, for for husband and wife and for children growing up in that context. But otherwise, it seems to me that what you have with so much of IVF, it is child trafficking. It is the commodification
Yeah.
of the child.
Yep.
It is the wanton destruction of human life. So it's a the end justifies the means kind of thing. The child is wanting to have a child is the
Yeah.
end, and so any means we use to get there, it does not matter. And of course, it does open us up to all kinds of family structures that are not at all compatible with the teaching of God's word and with God's design for us. So one way to look at this is the way that IVF can give you as many as 3 women involved in the creation of a child. You've got the biological or genetic mother, you've got the carrying mother, the surrogate basically, who carries the child for 9 months, and then what you might call the social mother, who raises the child. The reality is there's a bond between the child and the mother who created the child, and the father as well. There should be a bond with the child, with the womb, with the mother who carries the child, and of course with the social mother. But if you break that up, if you break up the mother into 3 different persons, it has. I think there's a lot of data out there on this. It has a tremendously negative effect on that child. It creates a wound in the life of that child that is very, very hard to heal. And so it's one of those things that, again, I think most people have not thought through all of the implications for this, especially from the child's perspective.
Well, and go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, this reminds me of an interesting experiment I did when I was in college, where me and some college friends went onto this liberal college campus up in Idaho, and we just walked around interviewing people and asking them the question, when does fatherhood begin? Right.
Great question.
It was a great question, because we were sort of taking the pro-life conversation and just going, let's come at this from a completely different angle. Let's just ask this question. And it was fascinating, how many kids who thought they were pro-choice just instinctively said, well, of course, as soon as the woman's pregnant, as soon as the child is made, and you go, okay, well, so what does it mean to be a father? We'd ask people, what does fatherhood mean? What are the responsibilities of fatherhood? And they started going down that path. And some dads, some fathers, it was clear that there were a lot of daddy issues, because you had a lot of these kids go, well, my biological father's not really my father because he never took responsibility for me, and so there was this kind of like this understanding that fatherhood is biological, but it's also comes with attendant responsibilities, and so it just was an interesting conversation, because virtually everybody that we talked to ended up in this place where they were like, gosh, I guess. So we started to say, so should a father, if fatherhood begins when it begins and a father has responsibilities, should they be involved in this decision, about murdering their baby? And it was like, and like most people, when you kind of came at it from that angle, had never thought of it that way and found themselves, really challenged. And so I think this is kind of another one of those kinds of conversations where we're saying, when do your responsibilities and obligations of fatherhood, motherhood, begin?
Well, Larson, that's a great way to put it, because your time. And so I talked about mothers. We can talk about fathers as well. Obviously, biblically, fathers must take responsibility for the lives they create.
Right.
So if you've got a bunch of children you created that are now in a freezer somewhere, how are you taking responsibility for them?
Right.
If you've provided sperm and you don't even know how it's been used, you don't know how many children you fathered. So it really severs that connection between fatherhood and responsibility that biblically and naturally is so important.
Well, think about it this way, right? And so, in Michael Foster's "It's Good to Be a Man," I think in there he talks about, you know, hypergamy when it comes to dating and sex selection, right?
Right.
And so we've told women this lie from the time they've started school to the time they graduate and then go to college and get in the workforce, that will just delay having children. Your career is the most important thing you'll ever have. So
Right.
now you take a woman who's older than 35, right, who's never been married, who has no prospects, suddenly realizes, oh, wait, I'm running out of time to have children. Well, let me start an IVF process.
Right.
Who do you think she's choosing from the sperm donors? You're
Right.
going to end up with the same 2% of male contributors
Right.
in the entire population. So what you're going to end up happening, when there's absolutely no social or moral restriction, right? Women are always going to choose the best guy in the portfolio,
Sure.
right? And so what you're going to end up having is these technological Genghis Khans,
Exactly.
where you end up with
Hmm.
2 or 3 men creating hundreds, even potentially thousands of children, typically within a local area, because they're the best option in the portfolio.
Yeah.
And so this gets back, Rich, to exactly what you were talking about earlier. If you don't know who your biological parents are in this age, you and your potential partners better be DNA tested, because the problem is you don't know who you're related to and who you're not.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Yeah. There's a documentary, and I've only watched the first half because the first half was free, and I think you had to pay for the second half, so I never got around to watching it. But I listened to a bunch of interviews with a guy. I think the documentary is called Birth Gap, and Jordan Peterson had him on his show and had like a 2 or 3 hour long conversation. It was really good. But he was talking about this phenomenon called he termed unplanned childlessness, and and it's women who, when interviewed, would say, I wanted to have kids, planned to have kids. And I wish I had kids, and that percentage is fairly high. It's like 85% of women say that they want to have kids. And so that it's 85% of women in most countries these days are not having children. And that's kind of the big takeaway of the documentary is it's not that people are having less kids, like as in fewer numbers of kids. It's just that fewer people are having any kids. The ones that have kids are still having the same numbers of kids, like the distribution of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, like that distribution is pretty much held steady with the category of people who have kids. The gap is coming from the number of people that have 0 kids, the percentage, and that's huge. And these women, they interview a lot of women in this documentary, and it's really tragic. I mean, these women who were told, this is how you do it. This is the path. And actually, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but there was I wish I could remember the article, but there was an article like there was a cover article on a big magazine like USA Today or one of these big publications. And it was like a picture of a woman in her 30s, and it was like, this is the new modern woman, and it was this whole page about how this woman is reaching for the stars in her career. She's done IVF. She's frozen a bunch of eggs and she's and embryos, and she's going to have she's choosing to do that later. She's going to focus on her career now, and there's no telling how many hundreds of thousands of women read that article, were inspired to follow this lady's lead. Well, just recently, there was a follow-up on that lady, and it turned out that every embryo that they froze failed. Like, every embryo died, and it turned out she wasn't able to have any children biologically.
And this becomes a big problem when you're talking about IVF and informed consent, right? The basis for any medical treatment is informed consent.
Right.
And unfortunately, people are not being informed about the risk of IVF.
Yeah.
Not only the risk of, hey, when we put those embryos in a freezer, there's no guarantee that we can revive them.
Right.
Right. Or how about all the additional pregnancy complications that come along with IVF?
Yeah.
What about all of the other medical problems that are created through IVF? And so part of the issue is these IVF fertility clinics are operating in this legal landscape with no limitations and without having to truly provide informed consent about the second, third, fourth order effects of a decision to move forward with IVF.
Right. This is kind of, well, it's not very far afield. It's just this is another one of those kind of moral hazard questions. But I saw something somewhere about sort of ministries or groups that were focused on adopting embryos, that had been discarded or sort of left for dead. Which, again, you still deal with a lot of the moral hazard potentially of surrogacy and that sort of thing, but it's a choice. I mean, it's a form of adoption, which adoption itself is an approach to, childlessness or even just charity, that anyway. So have you thought about that or explore, have you read anything about that whole idea, that whole world?
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I know some Christian couples who have looked into this and pursued it as well. So if you just take a step back and talk about adoption generally, I think there are a lot of Christian couples who get encouraged to enter into the adoption and foster process, but are not advised to weigh the costs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now we have a big issue here of we already have into the millions of frozen embryos sitting in labs across the United States. What do we do with those?
They're basically orphans.
They're basically orphans. I think Dusty Devers described them beautifully as cryogenically incarcerated with an indefinite sentence, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And so, I think it would be good, right, to advise Christian couples who are struggling with infertility. This is a option you should consider if you're weighing the cost appropriately.
Yeah.
But again, this does get us back into the absolute same problem of, are these embryos even going to be viable, right? How long have these embryos been in cryogenic freeze?
Right.
Is there biological data that can go along with this to at least help a parent inform their child about health risk factors, avoiding issues like incest, et cetera, down the road? Or, are we going to have to create a system where every single person is now going to have to go through 23andMe before they get married, right?
Right.
And so there are a lot of these kind of issues out there, even for the Christian who I think rightly and in a godly way is pursuing childbirth and trying to look at a way to use embryos that have already been created. I think that can be certainly a noble thing.
Yeah.
But again, when you're counting the cost, you do have to consider these kinds of moral traps.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so good. So think about this. Going back to what I said about fatherhood, you have a father who is donated his sperm or in one way or another has been party to the creation of all of these embryos that are now frozen.
Right.
Paul tells us in 1 Timothy, a man who does not care for his own family is worse than an unbeliever.
Right.
What does it say about that man who is not taking responsibility for for these children that he has been that he has played a role in creating? They are
Right.
his children.
Yeah.
And he has a responsibility for them. So when you do this on a society wide level, it is absolutely disastrous. It is the wanton destruction of human life. It is an injustice to those children who have been created. So let me move into another area here. I thought your article was really, really good. At the end of your article, you had some stipulations about basically what it might look like if we were to do IVF in an ethical way. So you propose some policies related to IVF, and I won't go through all of those. I'll let you talk about those. But one question I have, well, a couple of things. One is I've heard the claim, and I assume that this is true, that the IVF industry actually destroys more babies than the abortion industry. Okay, that seems
for
very
sure.
likely to me, given all of these realities in the process. So,
Wow.
Big fertility is really it's they tell us they're in the business of making babies, but they sure do kill a lot of babies along the way. So that's something we got to think about. And then there's also I wonder if the IVF industry would be big fertility, if it would be financially sustainable, financially profitable,
There it is.
if the policies you're proposing were implemented. So can you talk about that a little bit? I don't know how much study has been done on that kind of thing, but I know a lot of the money that obviously, and that's what this is really about more than anything, is money.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it comes from the fact that a lot of the embryos get donated to scientific research. There's a lot of other factors even there. But let's say that in the state of Alabama, and I do want to talk about what happened here in Alabama in just a minute, but let's say that we pursue the kind of policy recommendations that you lay out in your article. Would that kill the industry? Would it still be a profitable industry, a viable industry, if those kind of policy goals were pursued?
Well, let me start with that question, then I want to work back to the first question you asked. I think the kind of policy proposals I am proposing here would effectively end IVF.
Yeah.
It would be financially restrictive, right? Because if you think about where these companies make a lot of their money is also going to be in storage, right? Because you get to purchase a subscription plan for how long do you want us to store your embryos, okay?
Right.
And so I do think it would be financially prohibitive, right? But in this kind of thing, with the amount of moral hazard that comes along with that, I think that's a good thing. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. The simple fact that big fertility, as it is, operates in an environment where they're free from recourse, where there is no
Right.
limitations put on them. And let me give you an example. I don't know that there's been any study on like what the financial impact of these kind of proposals was have. But when the Alabama Supreme Court released their decision in this case, within a week, every single fertility clinic in the state of Alabama closed. That should probably tell you all you need to know about this industry when they're told from the Alabama Supreme Court, no, if you're going to operate here, you're going to have to do so ethically, and they close. That's pretty damning, in my opinion, because at a minimum, it shows that you're really not doing this to solve an infertility problem. You're doing this for profit, right? If this is about solving an infertility problem, you could continue to operate within an ethical scope, even if that increases your prices, right? But when you say, nope, if we can't operate the way we want to, if we can't keep doing it the way we want to, then we're just going to close. Well, that should tell me everything I need to know about the ethics behind your business model.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the question that was kind of alluded to there is the subscription model. What happens when you stop paying the bills? I'm certain these contracts have some sort of provision that kind of like the again, this is gross because it's commoditizing these humans, but it's kind of like a storage facility. You stop paying your bills and they get to take
That's right.
possession of what you've stored, right? So it seems to me that those embryos become the property of the clinic, and I have to expect that there's a secondary market, for these embryos.
They can sell them. I mean, you want to talk about child trafficking. I mean, this is the literal commodification of human life. It's the very thing that we're so against in so many other ways.
Well,
but
we
here
can hope that they're selling them to people who want children, but unfortunately, I don't understand if there's any regulations against selling them to labs who want to do tests.
But even if it's people who want children, think about this. Even if it's people who want children, what if somebody wants a child so they can have a sexual plaything?
Right. Right. This is the exact problem. Yeah. This is the exact problem.
When you have a child who gets adopted, usually that those prospective parents have to go through all kinds of testing basically to make sure they will be fit parents. But when it comes to IVF, there's no accountability or oversight whatsoever. You could literally do what I just described. You could buy a child. Obviously, you wouldn't go around advertising the fact, but you could buy a child and then hire a surrogate to give birth to that child. And then you take the child and then you do with that child whatever you want.
Well, and anyone who knows anything about the foster and adoption process knows how regulatory bound it is. It is so difficult for even good Christian parents to foster and adopt children.
Yeah.
When you enter a surrogacy contract, there is absolutely none of that.
Yeah.
It's absolutely, just pick a partner, sign a contract, and off you go.
Yeah.
But let me bring this back around to your question about the death rates with abortion compared to eugenics. And if you want to step back and think about this conceptually, when a woman goes into a clinic to have an abortion, the abortionist can only murder what's in her womb. Whereas in an IVF situation, it is an exponential increase, right?
Yeah.
So one woman can go in and create, potentially dozens of human lives that are then frozen and then discarded. That is an exponential increase to it's almost preposterous to put it this way, but the one at a time abortion of individuals in your daily abortion clinic, it's an exponential increase from what we're already seeing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. The thing that I think that we also have to think about with IVF is you've got the exponential increase in abortion. Essentially, it's become a something that we can scale at an incredible rate. But yeah, I kind of lost my train of thought. Actually, I had a particular thing I was wanting to say, and I'm like, where did it go?
Well, the problem is with this conversation, like this gets really deep really quick, right?
Yeah, there are so many different places you can go. I was thinking about just kind of transhumanism and that I started with that conversation, and transgender, it's not any different from that line of argumentation that we're basically saying we're transgressing, God's design. Here's what I was going to say. This is the question I was going to ask, Caleb, is I think we're talking about all the different all the different just immediate steps from IVF to, and we've already touched on probably 20 different very sketchy, situations that IVF creates. But I feel like legally, you're a lawyer and your job is to kind of think about the precedent that's being set and where this goes. And I think that's something I'd love to hear you talk about, because I think we need to be thinking about how we're defining life and how that, what's the Pandora's box that we're opening if we don't define these things very clearly.
So this was part of the. This is where it helps to understand the legal background for how we got here, right? So the Alabama Supreme Court decision was LePage versus the Center for Reproductive Medicine. Okay, so in LePage, the question before the Supreme Court was not whether IVF is legal. That was not the question. The question was whether, under the Wrongful Death Act, in the state of Alabama, whether plaintiffs could sue IVF clinics for negligently or intentionally destroying human lives. And what is fascinating about the posture of this case is that the Alabama Supreme Court, both sides, so the attorney for the fertility clinic and attorney for the LePage family, both agreed that an unborn child is a genetically unique human being whose life begins at fertilization and ends at death. The parties also concurred an unborn child usually qualifies as a human life, human being, or person under the ordinary meaning of the text of the Alabama wrongful death statute, right? So, like, that's where this case starts. Everyone agreed in this case in front of the Alabama Supreme Court, what is in those cryogenic freezers are human lives that have been conceived. I mean, just start with that conceptually is astounding.
Right.
And so, what the Alabama Supreme Court said is that the Alabama wrongful death statute protects human beings from conception till natural death, and that reproductive health fertility clinics are legally responsible for the negligent or not legally responsible, can be sued under the act for the negligent or intentional destruction
Right.
of human life. So that's where this case starts, right? The absolutely frustrating thing to me that happened after this was the Alabama legislature and governor stepped in within about 2 weeks and passed a law that gave blanket legal immunity to the entire fertility industry for both negligent and intentional acts. It is astounding that a Republican supermajority in the House, the Senate, the governor, and the Supreme Court has now passed a law granting full legal immunity. And I'm just going to tell you guys, from a lawyer's perspective, I think one of the greatest checks that we have as a free society on the way businesses operate in our society is not regulations. Regulations are subject to corporate capture. We see this, for example, with the pharmaceutical industry, with the defense industry.
Right.
The regulators are always captured by the industry. The
Right.
people who are not captured by the industry are plaintiffs' attorneys who have a monetary, financial incentive to
Right.
check these corporations. And so as soon as you create a legal limited liability for an entire industry, you are inviting malfeasance
Right.
because there's no check on them, and the only language these corporations speak is green. They only speak money, and if you can't hit them in their pocketbook, there's no restrictions to what they're going to do.
Right.
And for the Alabama legislature, who holds themselves out as conservative, to
Right.
come in and grant complete legal immunity for intentional or negligence, I mean, think about what that means: the intentional or negligent destruction of human life merely because that human life is located in a cryogenic freezer in an IVF lab is absolutely immoral.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
Well, and again, it comes back. I'm curious about sort of the precedent that's being set here. And I think we've already, like I said, we've listed out a lot of the different scenarios that could play out. But even outside of this conversation of IVF, this precedent's been set about about how we define human life, and what is allowed to be done in laboratories. The idea that we're just going to pursue science for science sake, and that we're going to, the ends justify the means. If we find some discovery, it doesn't really matter how we discovered it, if it's valuable and it helps people. But I think it seems to me that this leaves the door open, and sort of communicates that even in the most red states, supposedly, the politicians are going to have big pharma, big healthcare's back, and let them, do whatever they want in laboratories without interfering. I mean, I have to think that's. I don't know if you've dug deeper into sort of how this came about. This overturning or whatever it was called. That came through that basically gave IVF industry a free pass. But I have to think that there was a mobilization of lobbyists or I'm interested to know sort of how that all came about, why that all came about, because clearly sort of the people and the courts have spoken. So who was speaking when this came about?
Part of the big concern here is not with is not with big pharma or big fertility. We expect them to act in their own interest,
Yeah.
right? The problem is all the other so-called conservatives, from Donald Trump, Carrie Lake, her name is slipping my mind, because we addressed several of these conservative lawmakers who all came out at the same time, just absolutely denigrating the Alabama case.
Right.
And so, we see this with the pro-life industry all the time, right? Christians are waking up to the fact that the pro-life industry is a self-licking ice cream cone that exists for the purposes of its own existence, right?
Yeah.
And we've seen them in Alabama, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arizona continuously oppose abolition bills, and even recently in Arizona, working to get a criminal abortion statute in Arizona overturned that was upheld by their Supreme Court, right? And so, with friends like these, who needs enemies, right? And so, when you're looking at what is really the driving force behind this, we expect big fertility to act in their own interest. What we don't expect is other conservative leaders, particularly policymakers and policy influencers, to come in on the side of destroying human life.
Yeah. So this is really interesting to me and frustrating, distressing. And it's actually a point we had a brief conversation. Larson mentioned a podcast I was on, the Cross Politic podcast, to talk about a book I wrote recently. And we were, somehow we got into this issue. And one of those guys, either Toby Sumpter or Gabe Wrench, made the point that, like, if you think about all the different issues, the one that Christians seem to have been the best at dealing with has been the pro-life issue, abortion.
Yeah.
Because sometime, not too long after 1973, when the Roe decision was handed down, it dawned on Christians, oh, wait, they're murdering babies,
right,
literally murdering babies in the wombs of their mothers. We have to do something about that. And it mobilized Christians. And it's been this 50-year-long battle to finally get abortion, to get the Roe decision overturned. Obviously, that doesn't end abortion in our country, but it was still a significant victory of sorts. And it seems like Christians are pretty clear on the life issue when it comes to abortion. And so you can see that in the state of Alabama. We have, I don't think we've gone as far as we should in terms of criminalizing abortion and whatnot, but at least we have taken a stand on that particular issue. But then with IVF, you saw this flip within a matter of days where our Supreme Court, I think, made a really good ruling. And I think I looked at the logic of the ruling. I mean, they're quoting Calvin and Aquinas. It's talking about the imago Dei, the image of God. And so it was a really good ruling overall from what I could gather. And then within a few days of that, as you pointed out, you've got all of these Republican legislators and then a Republican governor who completely overturn that and don't come in and say, well, here's our opportunity to step in and basically put moral constraints on how IVF is done, respecting the fact that the life created in the Petri dish is life. Respecting the fact that God's got a certain design for marriage and the context in which life should be created. So let's respect all of that. No, what you get is blanket immunity for big fertility. And it's, you just want to say, like, who are these people? Who have we elected? And how are they either ignorant or willfully wicked in what they are paving the way to have, basically what the situation they're creating here.
Yeah.
How is it that we have these legislators and a governor in the state of Alabama, probably the vast majority of whom go to Christian churches and even somewhat fairly conservative churches, I would guess, and who are so utterly clueless about what is involved. And one thing that really hit me in all of that is that as a pastor, we have a lot more educating to do with our people. The flock needs to be taught the realities of what's happening here and how God's word comes to bear upon it, and what what it means to respect God's design when it comes to infertility issues. And it's just obvious that hasn't been done, or if it has, the elected politicians in the state of Alabama have chosen to not listen to it. To me, it was really, really discouraging to see that happen in our state. We're the reddest of the red states, pretty much. And if we can't get this right, in fact, if we get it wrong in the most wrong way possible,
Yeah.
It's not even just a matter of say some regulations on IVF. It's immunity. It's go do whatever
immunity.
you want. It's go do whatever go destroy as many human lives as you want. That to me is just disastrous.
Well, and I'll tell you, I know some of these guys who are legislators in both the House and the Senate, and look, they not only do they hold themselves out to be Christians, I think they are genuine Christians. They attend churches that I know, they attend churches that I trust, that are not mainline liberal pro everything churches, but these are men who are in local godly churches that are conservative churches, and they're still getting it wrong. And I think this comes back to we have done such a poor job in the United States of telling all of Christ for all of life. You don't get to apply God's word here and then go out in the public square and do whatever you want, right? No, if Christ is Lord, he's Lord over the Alabama legislature. And if you're in that body, you have a duty to act in a Christian manner, to preserve life, to reward good, to punish evil, and to keep government within the godly constraints that God has provided for the government. And your failure to do that is very clearly called sin. And but we're not telling these people this, right? We're not telling people there's a godly way to be a lawyer, there's a godly way to be a plumber, there's a godly way to be a legislator or a sheriff. And so what happens is, if we're not equipping these men with the word of God to go into the legislature to act in godly ways, if we're not equipping them with that, they're going to reach for worldly reasoning, for worldly philosophies. And that's really truly part of the problem here, is how do you have Christian men going to a legislature passing ungodly laws? They haven't been told that it's ungodly, or why that it's ungodly, or what their duty before God is as a magistrate. And this is a huge problem in all of our churches. I used to think pre-Dobbs, I remember telling a pastor once at a Southern Baptist church, hey, I love your theology on abortion. I love your theology on what the magistrate's duty to support life is. What I would really like you to do now is apply it to every other issue. But what Dobbs really revealed, Dobbs was apocalyptic in the sense of, it was really truly, it's like shone a spotlight, and we got to see all the cockroaches run off into the corners, right? Because what Dobbs did was, it demonstrated that people in the pro-life ministry didn't really mean what they told us they meant. And it meant that Christians did not really have a theological framework for how to deal with these issues, because if they had, we would have had answers when Dobbs was passed. And that's part of the problem. It revealed the error of our own theology. And these are not new subjects, right? We've known about the problems with eugenics for centuries, specifically when it comes to IVF and embryos. This was a debate early in the Bush administration. Like, I remember President George Bush personally meeting with the Pope on the issue of embryonic stem cell research. This is not new. These are things that we could have been thinking and preaching on for decades, and we've neglected.
Right. No, I worked.
That's so true. So, I mean, you're exactly right. And so, for me as a pastor, I realized I've got to take responsibility for making sure my people understand the issues involved.
Yeah.
Other pastors need to do the same. I think if you're looking for a weak link, I mean, I often think it's there. with the pastors who have failed to preach and teach. I certainly hold our lawmakers and governor responsible for what they've done.
Right.
They should know better. They've got a responsibility to educate themselves. And I don't know how many of them do know better, or how many of them, know better and voted a certain way anyway. But I think it's also incumbent upon pastors to teach their people about these things. We've got to be doing that, because these are huge, huge issues that just have a massive effect on people's lives. And so it's a huge issue. So I guess my question would be, how can we get your article into the hands of all of our legislators and our governor?
Write your local legislature and send them a link to the Republic Sentinel. It's, really, I'll tell you, to me, what's even more concerning, or really, disappointing about this whole thing is part of the excuse that we get on this issue, right? And I heard this in Huntsville with the Republican Party, which was, well, if we don't do something, then we're going to lose elections. Guess what? You're already losing elections. I mean, here in Huntsville, they flipped a seat from red to blue. For some reason, I'm getting bubbles popping up here on my screen. The Democrats were able to flip a House seat here in Huntsville, because the woman running as a Democrat was just a rabid pro-abort. And the man that the local party put up to run against her was this absolute milquetoast guy who ran away from the issues and wouldn't address abortion and wouldn't address IVF. I mean, I talked to him personally after a Republican Party meeting about, hey, put your feet in concrete and take a freaking stand, right? Stop backing off of these issues, right? And he just kind of hemmed and hawed and was like, well, I think, it's probably not very pragmatic. Well, the problem with pragmatism is when you run away from the issues, you're going to lose regardless. So at least lose with your boots on.
Right. Well, and I actually think that this is our opportunity to perhaps win. I mean, you're right. I mean, it'd be much better to take a stand and then lose. But one thing that I think really came out of COVID, and because that was apocalyptic as well in terms of just revealing where people are, is that a lot of people are hungry for courage in their leadership. Whether you're talking about in the ecclesiastical sphere or in the civil sphere, people are hungry for bold, courageous leaders who know what they believe, who can defend it, and who will take their stand and then let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah.
So yes. So why is it that in Alabama, again, perhaps the reddest of the red states, we don't have a state legislature filled with Dusty Deaver type men?
That's a great question.
Who will basically take their stand on these kinds of issues? Do we really not have the conservative culture that we think we do? Are we really not that conservative a state, even though we say we are? Is it just that the people that tend to get involved in politics tend to be more cowardly? But that's a question I think we've got to answer in our state, is why don't we have, if we say we're right at the heart of the Bible Belt, why don't we have more politicians who care about what the Bible says about these kind of things?
One of the important things I learned in the military is that moral courage is much more difficult than physical courage.
Yeah.
And COVID really showed us this in the military. I met a lot of commanders who could run really fast. I met a lot of commanders who understood their battlefield tactics, were never blinked at jumping out of an airplane, never blinked about leading people on deployment. But as soon as you put a moral problem in there, and now they have to show moral courage and not physical courage, they fail. And this is a real problem of moral courage is more difficult than physical courage. And so when we're asking people to go represent us in the legislature, we're really not asking them to show physical courage. We're asking them to show moral courage, right? To do what is right, do what is godly. And unfortunately, that takes a particular type of man to be able to do that, and those are not the typical types of men that end up going into politics.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a bit of a curveball, but I do feel like, where do you develop that moral courage? I think I'd put my argument in for you develop that in the marketplace, in your day-to-day job. If you're fully engaged in your work and you're behaving like a leader, you're taking responsibility, you're seeking out responsibility, you're going to find yourself constantly dealing with moral issues. There's just no way around it. We had an issue in our church recently that I think scandalized a couple of our pastors. And I was briefed on kind of the situation. I just said, guys, the people in our church who are in the marketplace, like as leaders, are dealing with morally compromising, difficult questions like this every single day, like multiple times a day, and so I do think that this, I'm kind of tooting the horn that I'm really on about these days, but just, men in particular engaging in the marketplace as leaders, taking responsibility. It's the best training ground. And I do think, as I was reading about sort of how this thing played out, if I'm not mistaken, my friend Ernie Yarborough was one of the few dissenting folks, and he tried to push an amendment, to the legislation that ended up passing, but it was voted against. So he's a guy, Ernie's made his mark in the private sector as a business person. Like, he's somebody who knows how to get stuff done.
Yeah, that'd be a great question to ask. Why don't we have more Ernies?
Yeah.
I mean, I mentioned Dusty Devers because he's higher profile at this point, but why don't we have a state legislature filled with Ernie Yarboroughs?
Yeah. I think, and if I remember correctly, I think Yarborough, I think his proposed amendment would have, at a minimum, not given liability for intentional destruction, right? And even that was shot down, right? So it's not as though this was not considered at all. I mean, and he's been one of the few shining bright lights to me of actually promoting conservative Christian values in the Alabama legislature. I've been really impressed with him over the last couple of years. To me, I think. So Michael Foster's County Before Country really struck home for me a couple of years ago, because COVID really did teach us that your sheriff is more important than who your president is.
Yeah.
Because who is going to be there to interpose when there's tyranny?
Right.
And the place I would start with this is, here's part of the problem you're going to have getting these types of men who go out into the marketplace and are successful, because they have all of those personality traits that you want in men who are leaders. They're disagreeable, or they're charismatic, they're very intelligent, they're assertive, right? Well, those men go into the marketplace and they become successful. And then they look and go, well, hold on a second. I'm going to have to take a half of my pay to go participate in the Alabama legislature and be miserable, dealing with other legislatures for half the year. That's really difficult. And so the problem is we create this counter incentive structure where the people who are best and brightest don't go into politics because they have to take a pay cut. And that's really simply true for a lot of people. But what if we could do this? What if we could say, hey, look, why don't we just try to get one man who's, if we want to use our Dusty Devers model, in the image of Dusty Devers, why don't we just try to get one of those guys on a school board, one of those guys on a city council, one of those guys as sheriff, and let them loose and see the blessings that can come along with that. I think that's where we have to start. Is we have to start sending people out into the battleground, and that starts with helping men understand that is a battleground that's worth fighting for and worth taking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, all your points there are great. And I think, part of it is, if you're a conservative, then politics is just a little box. It's not supposed to infiltrate everything. And
That's
so
right.
you shouldn't really have to spend all your day thinking about what's happening politically.
That's
so
right.
If you have a conservative set of instincts, you're not thinking politically all the time. But the reality is, if you want politics to stay in that box, you've got to have some men who are willing to go, keep it there. And I think in the state of Alabama, it's obvious our best and brightest don't go into politics, and I'm thankful for that overall in the big picture, grand scheme of things. I think that's the way it should be. But you do need at least a handful of really gifted and courageous men who understand statecraft, who understand Romans 13, who understand the Torah, who understand what God's word says about the role of the state and what it means for Caesar to render to God what is God's. You need at least a handful of those men involved in civic life, because that's what keeps politics in its box. And I do think having a small number of men who courageously take stands can continually move the Overton window so that you
Yeah.
end up in the right place.
Yeah.
But as of right now, we really just don't have enough. I mean, I think that's obvious.
Well,
And this issue, I think, really exposed that.
there's also just the role of journalism, and kind of watchdogs. And that's another thing that we've failed at. Where is the investigative journalist covering the backroom conversations that led to this immunity? Like I want to know who was bought out. I mean, it's a scandal. It should be a scandal that this happened in our state, and I don't see anybody digging out that dirt and reporting on it.
Well, and there's so few who are even willing to. I mean, Meg Basham is wonderful, but she cannot cover everything and every issue in every state, right? I would love an army of those, right, who are holding the people accountable, because, I mean, really, and this is truly like what we saw with the pro-life industry, is who is watching the watchers. Like so many people were entrusting the pro-life industry as like, okay, you guys have that influence, you guys have those connections, you guys are doing the right thing, until it starts to really matter.
Right.
And yeah, I think at the end of the day, part of what we have to do is encourage men. I have a friend of mine. One of my favorite sayings is, "You cannot leave government in the hands of people who believe in it." And so you have to send men into the government who inherently are skeptical about it, are skeptical about its powers and its limitations and its reaches, and who will fight to prevent government overreach and expansion. It's important to send those kind of men out. It's important to encourage those kind of men that these are issues that are worth fighting for and worth dealing with. And we have such a rich history as Christians of godly magistrates, that we can look to for inspiration, that this doesn't have to feel novel.
Right. Well, I'll make an obvious comment too, and I do think we need to kind of wind it up. So I'll let one of you guys get the last word, but I'll just make one other obvious comment, because I operate in the healthcare industry, and this kind of brings it all back to the Christian nationalism conversation of, is it politics that's going to save us, or is it politics that itself needs to be saved? And I think we agree it's the latter, and it's saved men going into politics that's going to change the culture. It's not going to be some top down. And so I'm in healthcare, and our problems just in the world of your basic healthcare and the way that insurance works and the way that government intervenes and the way that regulations operate. I mean, it's a cesspool. I'm interested in trying to kind of unplug individual physicians, from the matrix, and sort of get more practices interested in sort of free market ideals and that sort of thing, which I think is happening. I just went to the 10th annual Free Market Medical Association meeting. It's a small group still, but it's growing. But really, ultimately, what's going to move the needle more than anything in my little Free Market Medical Association world, it's going to be consumers. It's going to be patients who start to demand transparency. Patients who say, "Hey, I'm not okay with you dropping a $60,000 bill on me for a procedure that shouldn't cost more than $5,000." And demanding that transparency up front and holding people accountable. So the application here is yes, we need to get more pastors preaching. I think that's how we get more educated people. But ultimately, yeah, we're looking for turning the lights on, for your everyday Christian to start paying attention and caring and having train their affections such that something like this is just appalling, right out of the gates, and they're speaking out about it.
Well, Larson, as we land the plane, I'll say a couple things. First,
Yeah.
Caleb, I really appreciate you coming on. I really, really appreciated your article. It was. I mean, I read a lot of things when the Supreme Court ruling came down, and then, of course, when our legislature and governor reversed all of that. And your article is really the best thing I read on that. So
Thank you.
we need to make sure we get a link to that,
Yeah,
Larson,
we will.
in the show. And I think we should also link Katie Fowle's book, Them Before Us, because
Sure.
she's got a really good couple chapters on this issue. But, Caleb, you mentioned good men not going into politics because it's a pay cut. I totally get that. I understand why they wouldn't want to. In the early days of our nation's history, men who ran for office often did so at great personal cost
That's
and
right.
sacrifice. And it was understood that if you're going to serve in this capacity, it will be a sacrifice, and there may not be monetary rewards, but there will be other rewards, one of which is the opportunity to shape the culture and the future of the nation. And so we need a few good men in Alabama who are willing to do that. Larson, you mentioned media oversight. We've got a news organization now in our state that is doing this, 1819 News.
Yeah.
They are seeking to report on happenings in Alabama from an explicitly Christian perspective. You might even say from a Christian nationalist perspective. And they're doing really, really good work. And I'd encourage everybody to check out what they're doing and support their efforts, because that's also what you need, is a sort of media watchdog that will tell the truth about what's happening. You need a news organization that's nobody's in their pocket, nobody's controlling or steering them. They're sort of above the fray in that kind of way, and they come from the right theological and ethical perspective. And we've now got that in our state with 1819 News. So those are things that I think, people listening to this podcast, especially in the state of Alabama, should be aware of and just, think about that. So,
yeah, it's good. Well, thanks, Caleb. If we're going to link to the article on republicsentinel.com to your article, and we're also going to link to the book that Rich mentioned, Them Before Us. Is there if people want to stay up on what you're doing and what you're covering? It sounds like you're sort of a kind of a lay watchdog, so to speak. Is there where do people find you and follow you?
The best places to find me is on Twitter.
Okay.
That's where we're most active. That's the best way to keep up with me and the firm as well for everything that's going on. We've got big cases that are happening right now. So please continue to be in prayer for us for those, as we're really blessed that the Lord has really placed us in a position where we get to be in the fight.
Yeah.
And so Twitter's probably the best way to find me and to follow what we're doing.
Is that at Caleb Byr, or no? What is that? What is your?
Should be at Caleb N. Byrd.
Caleb N as in Nancy,
November.
or M as in yeah. Got it. At Caleb N. Byrd, Byrd.
That's right.
Cool.
Yep.
Awesome, man. Well, we'll link to that in the show notes as well. Thanks for tuning in. If you've made it this far, we appreciate it. And again, Caleb, thanks for joining us. This has been a lot of fun, and we hope to have you on again. It sounds like I think we'd have a fun time covering some other topics.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege. Thanks for having me.
The God a Minute podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy one of our other podcasts, The Good Life Podcast, featuring Matt Carpenter interviewing experts in their field about how their work contributes to the good life.